Jeff McDonough of Harvard University will now comment on Dan Garber's paper.
Okay. Just like to say thanks to the organizer, Sam, and thanks to Dan, and thanks for letting me comment. I really appreciate it. I enjoyed the paper a great deal. Okay. In his rich and engaging essay, Professor Garber asked most centrally, what was the relation between Leibniz's metaphysical project, as set out in the so-called Monadology, and the more theological project in the Theodicy? I'm going to spare you my French, so we'll go with that. His answer is, in short, that there isn't much of a relationship between these two great works. Furthermore, he takes this result to be evidence of Leibniz's not being a systematic philosopher in the spirit of Descartes or Spinoza. In these brief comments, I revisit Garber's two central questions in turn and offer some moderating resistance to both of his conclusions. I think this is it's much a matter of emphasis, perhaps, but anyway, so I'm going to push back a little bit. So first, is the Monadology and Theodicy? As Professor Garber rightly intimates, how one answers the question of whether the Monadology is present in the Theodicy depends in part on what one takes the central projects of these two great Leibnizian works to be. Garber offers a self-consciously narrow view of the project of the Monadology, describing it as sporting, quote, the metaphysical claim that the ultimate constituents of the world are non-extended simple substances, and contrasting it with, quote, the corporeal substance metaphysics that Leibniz held in his earlier years. Garber also offers a relatively narrow view of the project of the Theodicy, while conceding that, quote, the text in question is something of a rambling work which meanders through a large number of topics, including stories and observations of all sorts thrown in for good measure. He emphasizes that, again, quote, the central question is the problem of evil, unquote, and more specifically, the problem of moral evil is taken up in part 2 of the Theodicy, and the problem of physical evil is taken up in part 3. If we understand the central projects of the Monadology and the Theodicy in these relatively narrow ways, then I think we should agree that there isn't much to the Monadology and the Theodicy. I hasten to add that I don't think that this is a trivial result. I suspect it tracks Leibniz's hope that his general strategies for responding to the problems of moral and physical evil might be acceptable to those ignorant of or even opposed to his metaphysical atomism. As Garber acknowledges, however, one might alternatively take a broader view of both the Monadology and the Theodicy. As noted, the Monadology covers a lot of ground in short space, giving voice to, among other things, Leibniz's views on generation, preformation, the immortality of the soul, pre-established harmony, the principle of sufficient reason, the principle of contradiction, divine punishment, divine reward, and divine grace, to pick just a few topics. It even talks a fair bit about organisms and the embodiment of souls, themes seemingly more to do with corporeal substances than with immaterial simples. If the Monadology is centrally about Leibniz's reduction of the world to monads, and I think it is not at all obvious that it is, the Monadology is also, at any rate, certainly about many other things as well. Leibniz's Theodicy, the work, and Theodicy, the project, might also be viewed more broadly than Garber emphasizes in his essay. As he himself notes, the Theodicy is a wandering work, ranging over a wide variety of topics and themes, including, for example, generation, preformation, the immortality of the soul, pre-established harmony, the principle of sufficient reason, the principle of contradiction, divine punishment, divine reward, and divine grace, to pick just a few of its topics. Similarly, Leibniz's Theodicy, the project, arguably goes right to the heart of his thinking about the relationship between being and goodness, and via that deep core is directly related to many central Leibnizian themes, from the principle of sufficient reason to the principle of plenitude, from relationalism about space to plenism about the actual world. Viewed broadly, then, I think that Leibniz's Monadology can be found in his principal apologetic work. Indeed, to be more specific, I think the Monadology might be said to be of a piece with the Theodicy in at least two significant respects. First, the views expressed in the Monadology are consistent, or at least intended to be consistent, with the views expressed in the Theodicy. If the Theodicy doesn't put Leibniz's monadic metaphysics on center stage, it also does not, as far as I know, contradict any of its rather controversial metaphysical theses. Second, there's considerable overlap in the premises and surrounding arguments of the two works. If their foci are rather different, their background assumptions and arguments are much the same. In short, while the Monadology and the Theodicy may indeed highlight different regions of Leibniz's thinking, I see no reason for supposing that they do not represent a compatible, even overlapping pieces of a coherent overall worldview. 2. Was Leibniz a systematic philosopher? This brings us to Professor Garber's second question, the question of whether Leibniz was or was not a systematic philosopher. In answering this question, Garber rejects Russell's suggestion that Leibniz's philosophy is especially suited to a geometrical presentation, and denies that Leibniz is systematic in the same way as Descartes and Spinoza were, or at least in the same way as Descartes and Spinoza aspired to be. According to Garber, although, quote, there are interconnections between the various parts of his thought, unquote, nonetheless, those parts, quote, remain for Leibniz relatively autonomous domains that can be investigated independently of one another. I think Garber is absolutely right to suggest that Leibniz believes that relatively independent progress can be made in different domains. In the nice passage from the Discourse on Metaphysics that he quotes, Leibniz says as much, emphasizing that the geometer needn't, these are more or less quotes, burden his mind with the famous labyrinth of the continuum, that the statesman needn't trouble himself with the great difficulties involved in reconciling free will and God's providence, and that a physicist can explain some experiments, at times, without needing general considerations from another sphere. Even these bold statements, however, it seems to me, fall short of committing Leibniz to the rejection of systematic philosophy. For the suggestion that progress might be made independently on different fronts is perfectly consistent with there being systematic connections between the most apparently disparate domains. And indeed, such pronouncements are even consistent with the possibility that someone, perhaps a universal genius, perhaps a mathematician, scientist, and statesman of first rank, might not only see and appreciate those connections, but exploit them to make new discoveries and advances. In short, the suggestion that progress might be made independently on many fronts seems perfectly consistent with, for example, Leibniz's claim in the Theodicy that he has, quote, established in a conclusive manner a complete body of the main articles of knowledge that reason pure and simple can impart to us. A body whereof all the parts were properly connected and capable of meeting the most important difficulties of the ancients and the moderns. As a first-pass metaphor for Leibniz's thought, I therefore rather like the net analogy that Garber attributes to Michel Serres. To say that Leibniz's thought is systematic like a net is not, I take it, to say that there is a direct connection between every element of his thinking, or that all his commitments might be lined up in a neat deductive derivation. Rather, is to suggest that there is a sometimes more, sometimes less hidden coherence to the seemingly disparate elements in Leibniz's far-ranging works. That despite initial appearances, they do hang together to a remarkable extent, with elements in one domain being coherently, often surprisingly, linked to elements in another domain. Such a network of stronger and weaker, more direct and less direct connections strikes me as a good Leibnizian middle ground between Russell's overly optimistic deductive chain and Garber's rather more pessimistic, if much more sonorous, starry firmament. The enticing picture of a systematic Leibniz might, of course, still be spoiled by a closer examination of Leibniz's specific metaphysical commitments, in particular by a closer examination of his views on substance. For those attracted to the image of Leibniz as a great system builder, there's real reason to worry here. For it is, of course, not at all obvious how Leibniz's views on corporeal substance and immaterial simples might be coherently reconciled. Furthermore, in his book Leibniz, Body, Substance, and Monad, Garber has presented a detailed, sustained, and forceful case for there being important disconnects in Leibniz's treatment of substance, both over time and even within his mature years. A full defense of the systematicity of Leibniz's thought will therefore ultimately have to meet the challenge of showing how his thinking about substance might be reconciled with his having a coherent philosophical system. Ironically, I think the first part of the Theodicy, in which Leibniz explicitly expounds his views on the relationship between faith and reason, between philosophy and theology, might be of significant help on that score. Be that as it may or may not, however, I think it can at least be said that supporters of a systematic Leibniz shouldn't feel particularly threatened by the relationship between Leibniz's monadology and his Theodicy per se. Those two works could be the works of a non-systematic philosopher, but they could just as well be the works of a philosopher who holds that, quote, all is perfectly connected in the order of things. Thank you very much.
Anne, would you like to respond?
Not respond exactly, but just make a couple of comments. Thank you very much, Jeff. We really don't disagree, I think, all that much. To a certain extent, it is a matter of emphasis. On the first part about monadology and the Theodicy, there's a question about the actual text, the monadology, and whether or not that really, I talk about the monadology project as the doctrine that the ultimate constituents of the world are non-extended simple substances. You then point to the variety of things in the text of monadology. It's worth pointing out, as I mentioned briefly, monadology was not Leibniz's name for it. And I think the text really represents, an attempt at pulling together a whole bunch of different things from his system, many of which are indeed, as I pointed out, found in the book, the Essay to Theodicy. And you're right, the Essay to the Theodicy, as expressed in the Essay to Theodicy, and the larger Leibnizian system, as expressed in the Monadology, share many principles that he uses both in addressing the theodicy question taken narrowly, the problem of evil, and the metaphysical questions that he's taking up in the essay, The Monadology. As for, is it going to be a deductive structure? We both agreed it's not going to be what Russell suggested. But I still resist a little bit the Michel Serres net. I can remember about 15 years ago, Claudine Cohn and Andre Wakefield were working on Leibniz's geology, and they asked me to participate in the project because they knew, Leibniz being a systematic philosopher, somehow or another the knowledge of his philosophy must have something to do with his geological project. And I worked on the project with them, and after working on it a number of years, came to the conclusion they had almost nothing to do with one another. And it certainly is the case that for a wide domain of questions, they do form a kind of network, and they are interconnected in various ways. But if you want to step back, though, and look at, the remarkable figure who was Gottfried Wilhelm von Leibniz, and everything that he looked at, everything that he worked on, and put the philosophical things that we tend to focus on in the context of his prodigious intellectual enterprise, I think we get a different kind of picture. And that's the kind of thing that I suggested with the, you're right, the things that we think of as philosophical are, many of them, interconnected and share principles and, have resonances with one another. But it sort of fades out to other domains where there are quite different things going on. And to try to impose too much coherence on Leibniz is, I think, not to appreciate something of his special genius.
Questions?
Sure, you're going to get a lot of questions on it if you sit down.
Would you like to?
No.
Did you want to say more? Twinkling stars or nets? Yes.
I don't know, not to worry.
Had a couple questions. Really enjoyed both of your papers. A couple questions, Dan. Just a couple of texts that I think are relevant to a few of the claims that you're making. So one, there's this talk about the net analogy, whether that's a good analogy. Leibniz himself uses something similar to that in some texts. So here I'm thinking about a 1708 letter to Debos, October 1708. There he says, "My views certainly are connected with each other in such a way that no link can be removed without the chain being broken." So I think that's an interesting text.
Which views was he talking about?
Right. I think he's talking about sort of the core metaphysical views. He's not talking about geology in that context. But you might think that sort of a quote suggests that at least the monadological metaphysics might be a little bit more crystallized. So it might put a little bit of pressure on the thesis that the reason he's not bringing it in is because he's not really sure about the details. And then the second text I wanted to point out is about the relation between